Well, it's the first book of its kind in more than 30 years. News 1130's John Ackerman has more on a new history of the Hudson's Bay Company, which looks at the facts through a more inclusive lens.
In The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, Stephen R. Bown is mindful of changing views in contemporary society, including who belongs in national histories and their role in so-called big story events.
And that's what I've tried to do with my book, is to bring in sort of a wider, more diverse group of characters who contributed to the company over the major years of its operations, and to distinguish between those different periods of the company.
Bown takes particular care to highlight the role of indigenous peoples in the Hudson's Bay saga, and how the company wasn't always the large controlling monopoly it's been made out to be. The book marks an evolution in Canadian historiography and may inspire similar reappraisals of our collective past. I'm John Ackerman.
Well, it's a history that's been told and retold numerous times, of course, from scholarly articles, even in elementary school textbooks. Now the saga of the 350-year-old Hudson's Bay Company being told again in a new book, The Company.
The full title is The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, and it's the first treatment of the subject in more than 30 years. Author Stephen R. Bown notes that the world has changed a lot since then, particularly our view of how indigenous peoples fit into the story, as well as the interpretation of primary sources.
For example, you take an explorer's journal. It's very easy to fall into the trap of telling the story from the point of view of someone who wrote the journal. And what I've tried to do is emphasize that the journal is the source, but it's not the story.
Bown argues the company wasn't always the large controlling monopoly it's been portrayed to be. Rather, for much of its history, it was just another player in the larger indigenous societies of the time. I'm John Ackerman.
Well, it's been said the early history of the Hudson's Bay Company, the origin story of modern Canada itself. News 1130's John Ackerman speaking with the author of a new book. Aims to tell the story using a greater diversity of perspectives.
Stephen R. Bown's The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson's Bay Empire, is the first book of its kind in more than 3 decades, and Bown is quick to point out why it's a story worth revisiting now.
Over the past 30 years, our society has, undergone a lot of changes and opened up our concepts of who should be included in national histories and big story events.
Bown takes great care in showing that the company wasn't always this enormous British monopoly that controlled and manipulated everything in its path. In fact, for much of its history, it had to adapt and coexist with the indigenous societies that were already there, and how First Peoples were an active part of its corporate structure as well. I'm John Ackerman.